Hello. What we're talking about in this video are some of the features of RStudio that you can use to make editing code a great deal easier. Before we start, I should just say something about keyboard shortcuts. RStudio has a keyboard shortcut basically associated with everything you can possibly do, and some of these are really useful, and it's really worth learning some of them because it's a lot quicker to use them than it is to pull down a menu, search for something and click on it. If you want to know what keyboard shortcuts are available, if you go to the Tools window, you can click on Keyboard Shortcuts Help, and that brings up all of these keyboard shortcuts here. You can also, if you want, define your own keyboard shortcuts in RStudio. So if there's something that you do very often and you want to define a keyboard shortcut for that, you can do that in RStudio. But a lot of the things we're going to be doing here use keyboard shortcuts and are quicker with keyboard shortcuts. So let's start with just looking at our script here. And one thing that is very common in R is that there are lots of brackets or parentheses or braces or whatever you want to call them. And RStudio kindly highlights the closing bracket that matches an opening bracket if you click next to the opening bracket, or it highlights the opening, or it should highlight, yes, it highlights the opening bracket associated with a closing bracket if you click next to that. One other thing that you can do in RStudio is you can actually skip to the bracket that matches the one that you're looking at. So if we go down to this piece of code here, which plots a graph, there's quite a few lines there, but there's only one set of brackets, and you can see the matching bracket here. If I type Control P, that will move the cursor to the matching bracket, and if I type Control P again, it'll move it back. So that can be really handy if you have, for example, long if statements or long for loops in a piece of code and you're trying to find the bracket that matches the one that you used to open the statement. Sometimes that can be quite difficult, and using this bracket matching highlighting and also using Control P can be really useful for moving between them. If we go to the code window and we pull this down, pull this menu down, we've got lots of options here. Some of these are really useful, or some of these I find really useful, and the ones we're going to look at are going to be the comment uncomment lines one, the reformat code and the reindent lines. These are all really useful when you're writing code, in my experience. First of all, comment code. If you highlight or select a block of code like that and you either pull that down and select that option, or better, you press, for a Mac, Shift Command C, for a PC, Shift Control C, it will just comment the whole lot for you. And then if you run that script, that code isn't going to run. Equally useful, if you do the same thing again, so I'm going to press Shift Command C again. If you do it again, then it uncomments those lines for you. So that's really useful. Some of the other things that are really handy, let's say you're someone who writes messy code, or one of your colleagues, more likely, is someone who writes messy code, probably an eminent professor, and they've sent you a script and it's got lots of things like this in it. So you've got a massive function call here with stuff everywhere and it's difficult to see what's going on. If you get something like that, you can just highlight it, and then again you can either pull down that code menu and select reformat code, or you can just use the keyboard shortcut, which in the case of a Mac is Shift Command A, and for a PC it'll be Shift Control A. And if you do that, RStudio will magically tidy up your code for you, which is brilliant. RStudio will also add to the indents. So if you press Command I or Control I on a PC, or if you have code that needs to be indented, if you have code that needs to be indented and you press Command I, it will indent that code for you without you having to go through the whole reformat thing. But that's really helpful. So if you get, as I say, a script from a colleague with horrible messy code everywhere, Command A or Control A, select the whole lot, Shift Command A, and it will reformat that code and make it much tidier and neater for you to use. A final really useful keyboard shortcut that you can often find yourself using is when you need to do something repetitively with maybe just 1 or 2 changes per line, you can use Shift Command D, and that will just duplicate a line for you like I've done here. And that can also be very useful when you've got repetitive stuff going on. Okay, so that's one of the things that RStudio does. Another thing that it does that's really useful is it auto-completes things for you. So RStudio will look at what you're typing and then look at what's sitting there in the R workspace, and it will also look at the R functions that are available. And if what you're typing matches one of those things, it will give you the option of an autocomplete. So if we're typing the name of our data frame, for example, UFO $, it then gives us the option of the 2 variables that are in the data frame, and you can select them either with a mouse or you can select them with the up and down keys, and either enter or tab will select that option for you. Maybe not so difficult when you've only got 2 variables with short names, but when you've got a big data frame with lots of variables and some of them have long and difficult to remember names, that's really, really useful. Autocomplete doesn't just work for data frames and the variables in the data frames though, it will also work for functions in R. So if I type as.fact or asFac, it gives me these options, and I can select the asFactor function using tab or enter once again. Interestingly, and quite useful to know, RStudio uses fuzzy matching here, and you don't actually have to type all of the important letters in the right order. So if I just type as FCT, it gives me the same options again. Or if I type as.fr, it gives me some rather different options, but one of those is asFactor. So you don't even have to type all the letters in the right order to get the thing you want in auto-completion. A final thing that autocomplete will do is it will actually look at the variables that you've defined. So if we define a variable called var1 and we run that through the console, and then we define another one called var2, then if we type va tab, it gives us all the options that match that, and down here you can see var1 and var2 have popped up in there. If we make it var, then we've got rather fewer options to choose from. So the auto-completion in RStudio will also look at the variables that you've made and put in the workspace, and if they're there, it will offer you that option too. So that's really good. Okay, sometimes you want to change the name of a variable or a data frame or something like that all the way through your code in R, and there's a couple of options for doing that. One option is to use the Find and Replace button up here. So if you click on that, it brings up a little Find and Replace dialog box. So let's say we've decided we don't like having our data frame called UFO, and we want to change it to UFO1. So if you put UFO in the find box here and we put UFO1 in the replace box, we can replace all, and that will change UFO to UFO1 all the way through, and that can be really useful if you're wanting to change the name of a variable in your script. Let's just change that back, so we can say UFO1 to UFO, replace all, and there we go, we're back to UFO. Something that's a little bit quicker, if we just close that, is if you highlight the name of the thing that you want to change and you use the keystroke shortcut Command E or Control E on a PC, that will open the search window, the find and replace window, with the thing that you've got selected already in the find window, and it's then easier to replace that with UFO1. So we can do that there. A second option for changing the name of a variable is if we pull the code menu down again, you can see that there's something called rename in scope. So if you highlight UFO1 and you go to rename in scope, what that actually does is it gives you lots and lots of cursors, one by each instance of UFO1, and you can use that to change it to whatever you want. I'm just going to change it back to UFO, but you could change it to Steve if you wanted. And that's an alternative way of changing the names, of changing all the names of a variable in RStudio. One warning though is that this seems only to work, and it doesn't do it every time, it missed that one there. This seems only to work when you have code in a single code section. We haven't got onto code section yet, we're going to look at that next, but that's something important to bear in mind. I think that's probably a bug. Certainly I had a look on the RStudio webpage and it seems to be there as a bug, but for the moment I would stick to using the find and replace, although in future it may be that they'll fix the replace all in scope option. Okay, so these are all options for editing your code. There are also some really good options in RStudio for helping you navigate through your code. So let's say you want to divide your script into two parts. You want to have one part which deals with importing and cleaning your data, and then a second part that deals with plotting the code. What you can do is you can insert sections of code. So if we just make some space there and we go to code, insert section, it comes up with this and says, what do you want for the section label? And we're going to call that import and clean code. And you click OK, and you can see it inserts some text here. You can actually write your own. You simply put in a comment and then you put at least 4 dashes after it, and it will see that as a code section as well. So that's a code section, and then we can put one here, and we're going to use the keyboard shortcut, which is Shift Control R instead of using the menu. So Shift Control R, and it says what's the section label, and I'm going to call that plot graph. And there we go, we've got another section. So why are we worrying about this? Well, there are a number of important things that you can do when you've got code sections like this. First of all, you can fold the code. So you can hide all the code in a particular section. If you want to do that, there's a little button here next to the name of the code section, just this little down arrow in the side of the RStudio editor window. And if you click on that, it will fold your code up for you. So we can just hide everything and then only see the plot code if we want, and we can open everything up again. And there are various keyboard shortcuts for opening and closing those sections as well. So we can fold our code, which can be really useful when you've got a big script and there are bits that you're happy with, you don't want to look at them. You can just fold them up and then you don't have to see them when you're navigating through things. But also you can open a document outline here, and that gives you the names of the sections, and you can click on them and it will move you between them. This will also show you the names of any functions that you define in your script. So if you're defining functions in your script, the names of those functions will also show up in this document outline here. And this is a really useful way of navigating through a long script. Really well worth doing if you're dealing with long scripts in R. So those are ways of navigating through your code. And then I'm going to talk about one final option that you have, which is what are called code snippets in RStudio. These are actually little text macros that you can use to make it easier to put in complicated functions or other things as well. And RStudio calls them snippets. If you type the name of the snippet, it will come up in that autocomplete window as a snippet, and if you select it, it then gives you some options. So let's say we want to generate a matrix in R. So we're going to call our matrix mat1, and we're going to use the allocation symbol, and then we're going to type mat, which is the code snippet that brings up the mat snippet, which gives you all the things you need to make a matrix. So we've got the matrix function call, and then we've got a series of arguments that you can fill in. So if you just type whatever you want for each argument, you can use the tab key to move between them. So here I'm going to just say R norm 100 for our data so I just tabbed to move from that bit to the next bit that's there to fill in. Number of rows is 20, number of columns is 5, and if I run that code, we now have a matrix with 20 rows, 5 columns filled up with random numbers. There it is. So there are snippets in RStudio that you can use for these tasks that require a bit more in the way of keystrokes. If you want to see a list of them all, if you go into Tools, go to that Global Options window again and click on Code, then down at the bottom where it says Enable Code Snippets, if you click on Edit Snippets, that just gives you a list of all of them. It doesn't tell you what they do. You'll have to find that out yourself, but it does give you a list of all of them. You can edit them in this window. It's just a text editor. And you can also write your own snippets. Writing your own snippets isn't that difficult. Here's an example of one that I wrote here. The dollar symbols specify where the different fields that the user should fill in go. Each one is numbered, so it knows what order to go through them in. And we have some indentation. One thing that's very important apparently is that you must indent using tabs rather than spaces. I don't know what happens if you do indent using spaces, but for the good of humanity, I suggest that you don't do that. So this is a snippet I wrote myself. It's just something to make it faster for me to generate graphics using the ggplot2 package. If you're not familiar with this, it's just an R graphics package that's an alternative to the base R graphics system. It's very popular at the moment. I find that when I'm generating graphics in ggplot2, there are some things that I tend to do every time. So for example, I always use theme BW because I'm allergic to the default ggplot2 color scheme. So I thought, well, I can just write a snippet that has all of these things that I always use in there, and that's going to make life easier for me. So if you're not familiar with ggplot2, don't worry about it, but I'm just going to show you how this works as an example. So we can get out of that, and get out of that, and then all I have to do is type ggplot and then tab, and it brings up my little macro. So I need to give the plot a name. I'm going to call it plot1. The data is UFO, and then next up is the X variable, which is reports, and the Y variable, which is count. We want the line geom, which is going to draw a line graph for us, and then we need to give our X and Y axes labels. So the X label is year, and the Y axis is sightings, and then that's all done. So that just makes things easier if you're doing this kind of thing, and I didn't have to type in theme BW or anything like that. And if I pass that over to the console window, it runs the code, and then to see the graph, I just type the name, and there's our plot. So that's just an example of the kind of thing that you can do with snippets. If you're just starting out, obviously you're not going to be wanting to do much that's particularly sophisticated with that kind of thing, but it's worth knowing that they're there so that if you do find yourself doing something quite repetitive like that, you can actually just go in, write your own snippet, and there you are. So just to sum up, there's all sorts of things in RStudio that are going to make your life easier when you're writing code. Please bear them in mind. It's going to make things easier for you. Doing things like putting code sections in and using the document outline is going to make your life a huge amount easier if you're writing long scripts. Learning some of those keyboard shortcuts. Let's just remind us we can pull all the keyboard shortcuts up just by doing that. In fact, there's even a keyboard shortcut to get the keyboard shortcuts. That's going to make things much faster when you're editing code, because it's a lot quicker to just type a few keystrokes than it is to start messing around with a mouse or a trackpad.